Hi, I'm Betsy Poole, and I'm the narrator of the oral storytelling project, The Story of Everything. The Story of Everything is a three-part documentary trilogy that takes us through the teachings of Alberto Aurati Falco Tarasico, the founder of the community of Dominor in northern Italy. On April 17th of 2021, we premiered part one of this three-part trilogy. And out of that screening, which was hosted by Charles Eisenstein and attended by many members of the NAAS community, a series of questions arose. So today I want to take the opportunity to hopefully provide a little bit of insight into some of these questions. And you are back in the story room, and we may have a bell or two in the background, but I'm going to just start and go through the questions that came in that evening. So one of the first questions that came in was the question, how does this story help us in our day-to-day lives? One of the reasons that I was so passionate about creating this project is that I feel that as humanity on this planet, we're lacking a core story that unites us across country, nationality, religion. We really don't have a story that represents humanity on Earth as a whole. And so this story attempts to be that mythology that could be this mythology that represents global consciousness. We often say that the shortest distance between two people is a story. And if we had a unifying story that actually applied to all of humanity, maybe that could go a long way in terms of breaking down many of the barriers that exist. Imagine if we had a mass visitation by non-terrestrial beings. This would be the story that all of us share when we actually were to meet with these non-terrestrial beings. So this first question, how does this story help us in our day-to-day lives? You may recall that in the context of the first part of our story, we spoke about a number of massive battles that at the end of each battle, there was a detente between the opposing forces and humanity. And each of these battles left humanity without certain internal senses and without certain archetypes. I think that in our day-to-day lives, if we understand that in some ways our human potential has been limited by the loss of these senses and these archetypes, that it might inspire us to in fact work to regain or reconquer these lost senses and these lost archetypes. Here in our community of Dominor, we have an open university where one can study non-conventional subjects like dreams, the dream realm, astral travel, past life research. And so in taking these courses, we have a window into some of the non-conventional senses that have been lost over the course of these battles that happened many, many millennia ago. So on a day-to-day basis, if we have the sense of dream, the sense of a world that is larger than our day-to-day existence, I think this gives us an opportunity to grow both in terms of our human potential and also as a connected collective. The next question that came in was, what are the scientific methods or instruments for obtaining this knowledge that was presented in the story room? Can an individual human come to know this through introspection? What I want to again point out is that at a certain point in our history, due to three massive events that happened on this planet that actually led to the final destruction of Atlantis, there was a tear in the space-time continuum. And the timelines representing the story that we tell in the first part of our documentary were disconnected from the storylines and the timelines moving into the future. And so scientific methods while wonderful for exploring our material world, while science is the best method to define the material world, it's not exactly the best method to describe our entire human experience. The language of science is limited. We can't study certain areas like consciousness. Consciousness at this point is only beginning to be tapped by some of the people in the scientific realm who've hit a glass ceiling in their research if they can't take consciousness into consideration. And sitting down with many of those physicists, when I ask them the question, do you feel that science is a broad enough language to describe our full human experience? The scientists themselves are the first to say to me, no, it's not. It's in fact a method that really has its limitations in the material universe. With the timelines disconnected, essentially the information from this first part of the story is not able to cross into our part of the story. The man who delivered this in his teachings was not your average human. He was a man in physical form, but he was also hosting an avatar who had his full memory of what happened in the past. And part of his mission here was to teach and bring to us this bigger story of humanity. And so if you say to me, could the individual actually through introspection realize all of this story that I related, I would say that given our limitation in our senses and our loss of archetypes, it would be very difficult for an individual just through introspection to remember all of this material. So the next question that came in was, why should this seemingly linear and limited cause and effect story full of epic battles trying to eliminate uncertainties be better than already existing stories? And I would say it's not that this story is striving to be better than other stories. My desire in this was to have a more cohesive story that in fact explored the ancient histories and mysteries. And so while we always say within our community, we don't have the truth in our pocket, and you can encounter this story as simply a science fiction story, I think for many there's a resonance on a deeper level. And if indeed we share this past, it would make sense that somewhere within our collective consciousness, these pieces of this story exist beyond the mind of the one man who brought this as a spiritual leader and teacher of this broader story of humanity. So again, I don't think that it's a better story. It's simply a story that works to unite a mosaic of stories into a single narrative. Also, I would say that this is not exactly a linear story. When we start to look at the subject of time empires and timelines that are fragmented, it actually becomes not a linear story. As a storyteller, in order to convey it, it comes across as a linear story because that's how our minds organize things when we're telling a story. But in fact, this story stretches across many timelines and also involves travel into different parts of the time territory. So it's not linear when we look at time as a territory as opposed to a linear structure. Okay, the next question that came in was, what good are you hoping this can do the world, and why do you think it has the potential to be universal? Why do we need so much knowledge from the outside? Shouldn't we be encouraged to learn non-duality by means of introspection? I would first address this idea of non-duality. I believe that we live in a world that is fundamentally dualistic, based on how the universe was formed and the intelligence that entered the world of form with a different objective than the original world of form had. This is part of what we cover in the first part of the documentary. Further, in terms of what good I'm hoping to do in the world, my feeling again is that story is something that connects us. And if we find a story that represents us beyond the borders of our countries and our nationalities and our religions and our socioeconomic brackets, if we find a story that, if looking at the Earth from space, could be resonating from this planet as a universal story, I think that that would lay the groundwork for very different social interactions between humans on this planet. So the next question that came in: is there a way to express this mythology without the references of hierarchy, battles, and empires that are easily subsumed by the old story? And I would say, in fact, no, there's not a way to express this story when we look at it as a history. It's like asking, could we actually express modern history without including the world wars that have happened? It's a part of our human experience, these epic battles and these hierarchies. And I don't think that we can whitewash and ignore them. It doesn't mean that we have to live our lives based in conflict, however. Is there still a time portal near the Earth open, or maybe used at present time? In the story, we don't speak about time portals. We speak about star passageways. And a star passageway can be explained utilizing a fan like this. So if we were to imagine that this stay on the fan is one part of the universe, and this is another part of the universe, when a star portal opens, it essentially brings these 2 points together. And that decreases the distance between 2 very distant points in the galaxy. As to the question, are there still star passageways open near the Earth? I would have to say that I can't say for certain yes or no. I feel that in many ways, one of the reasons that this material needed to come out at this time is that we may, in fact, be on the verge of seeing a star passage open again. And this would provide context if we were to be visited again by evolved beings from other parts of the galaxy. So the second part of this person's question is, so the Atlanteans used the synchronic lines for space travel, perhaps? And indeed, yes, that's the case. The synchronic lines were, at that point, being utilized rather than the star passageways. And the synchronic lines, as we may recall, are the channels of energy that can host life force. And so traveling through space using synchronic lines, of course, requires a level of technology and consciousness that we may not have at this point in our history. But in the Atlantean times, yes, they were using the synchronic lines also as travel passageways between more distant parts of the galaxy and Earth. So the next question that came in is, what, if any, do conventional mainstream religious and spiritual paradigms play in this mythology/story? In fact, the aspects of our current modern-day religions are addressed in the second and third part of this documentary, when we begin to speak about what we call territorial divinities. Our next question: what, if any, do conventional mainstream religious and spiritual paradigms play in this mythology/story? In part 1 of our 3-part documentary, we're not addressing the mainstream religions. Those come into play in part 2 and part 3 of our story, and in fact play a huge role in part 2 and part 3. You can in fact support us in the realization of part 2 and part 3 by going to our Patreon campaign, The Story of Everything, and we'll also post the link here, and helping us to, in fact, bring together part 2 and part 3, where we speak in depth about the current religious and spiritual paradigm. Also, this person says, apologies for broaching this, but is there any physical evidence for some of these claims? Part of what happened when there was this massive break in the space-time continuum is that information in the form of ruins and other physical evidence weren't able to pass across the chasm in time. There's work that's been done to, in fact, create a bridge over this time chasm. And as that bridge is densified, we start to see coming into the mainstream archaeological record elements that don't carbon date onto the current acceptable timeline. The Sphinx in Egypt is one of those. The water damage on the Sphinx tends to suggest that it's much, much older than we've come to date it on our archaeological timeline. And so I wouldn't say, no, there's no physical evidence, but there's not a preponderance of physical evidence. And in terms of your question, how do we note the truth in this story? Again, I would say to you, we don't feel we have the truth in our pocket. I think truth is, in fact, a many-faceted diamond. What you can do is to watch this story and tune in to yourself to see if there's resonance inside of you for this story that's been related. Question 8, I think we also addressed in the Q&A that we had after the screening. And this question was, can the missing link in knowledge be encoded in our symbiotic relationship with the plants? I believe the plant world, in fact, holds a deep consciousness of many of the aspects of this story. And in fact, the world of the trees is a world of conscious beings that carry our history. So yes, I think that if we were to be able to open the connection on a deeper level with the plant world, there would be a flood of information that comes through to us also about the ancient history of humanity. Number 9, question number 9. You said that after deciphering the code of life, history could be changed. Why should it be changed? So I would say to you, certainly there have been events in the past in our history that were, in fact, very pejorative for humanity. And if we could, in fact, eliminate the suffering that has existed on this planet, would it not make sense? Would it not be in the service of humanity to do so? So in that way, this idea of being in a holographic universe that's made up of information vibrating at frequency, if we could hack that hologram and insert new information, that's what could shift history, also going what we would say is back in time. Further, this person in the question goes on to say, the desire for development and awareness is largely driven by becoming aware of history. And I would say, in fact, if we were able to reawaken the lost senses and the lost archetypes that have impacted our full human potential, we wouldn't need the pain of the history of the past in order to grow and learn and move into the future. We could be building the future from a generative perspective rather than lessons learned from bad parts of our past. So the next question actually comes also with a note to us, and this is from Laura George, who's the founder of the Oracle Institute in Virginia. And she asks, first she says, we are honored by the credit line at the end of the film. It was a privilege to introduce you, and in fact, it was Laura who introduced Charles Eisenstein and myself, and also Paxis, who was part of the initial incubator. So she says it was a privilege to introduce us, and we're quite grateful for those introductions. And that was in the 2008 Building the New World conference. She says, "We love and honor you, Falco, the people of Dominor." And second, this story definitely resonates and leads her to ask a question. As a cell in this mission, the Oracle Institute and Valley of Light community needs assistance to anchor the proper energetic wavelength. Can you please let us know how best to find and gather our brothers and sisters who share the mission in the United States, where the opposing forces are gaining ground? And this was from Laura George. And so I would say to those of you who are interested in community, you can reach out to the Oracle Institute and Laura George and find if there's resonance for you in the mission of that community. And I think simply by sharing and finding others who are willing to share, this is how we find. Existing is a call, Laura. The existence of the Oracle Institute, an institute for peace, is its own call in the world. And one of the things that we always recognize as an activist is that you do the work as an activist even though the outcome of that may not be realized within your lifetime. And so having the larger perspective of building this peace community in that special area in Virginia, seeding that, you've done an enormous service to humanity in creating that. And so I would say, honor what you've done, pat yourself on the back, and allow the people to be drawn to that at the right moment in their lives and in the life of the project. So the next question is, what is there beyond story, and where would we be without our individual and collectively held and enacted stories? Again, I keep going back to this adage, story is the shortest distance between two people. And I think that story is part of our biology as humanity. We need story to organize our lives and our mental and thought processes. So story has a critical role. And in fact, in the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, this is how important story or narrative is. So the Hadron Collider in CERN was shut down for renovation. And when they reopened it, in their public outreach, they had to understand how to story their research in a way that it could, in fact, reach a global audience. And what they found was that how they were storying their research was affecting reality at the level of the quantum. And they actually conducted an experiment where they invited in filmmakers and other artists to see how, at the level of the quantum, reality could be affected by story. And what they found was that the strongest effect on the level of the quantum occurred with haiku poetry, which is quite interesting because haiku is based on a kind of mathematical formation that conveys emotion. And so essentially what they were finding was that narrative or story is creating reality at the level of the quantum, which begs the question, what kind of stories are we putting into the world? And what resonant effect are those stories having in terms of creating a mirror to those stories in our reality? If we're telling dystopian stories, are we manifesting a dystopian reality? If we're telling a story of a more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, are we not manifesting that world? And so I think it's in our choice of the stories that we tell, we can have a profound effect on the fabric of reality. So the next question, Can you tell us more about the 9 primeval divinities? Who are they? What do they do? Are they still alive? How do you create one? Do they have names? Are they dead? I think that we need to actually clarify what we mean by primeval divinity. Primeval divinity is not a god in the sense of our religious or spiritual paradigms. These primeval divinities were, in fact, absolute intelligences that were running through the cosmic plenum. And each of these absolute intelligences, so these are not individuals, these are not akin to humans. These are huge intelligences. And when they come into the world of form, they fragment into everything. So that you could, in a way, say that this primeval divinity is, in fact, consciousness that's coming into reality and fragmenting into everything. They don't have names in the conventional sense. We refer to them as 1 through 9. And the 4th primeval divinity we refer to as the primeval divinity of humankind, and represents essentially the collective human soul. Okay, so the next question, how do we get rid of the contamination and get our senses back? This is a wonderful question. I think that being aware of the fact that we carry an aspect of entropy, and being aware when we are in our lives interacting from that fragment of entropy, as opposed to reacting from an evolutionary or a conscious place. And so getting rid of the contamination, I think, happens by building awareness. The idea of enlightenment would be an aspect where that contamination is eliminated. In terms of getting our senses back, first we have to understand what those lost senses are. Within our community, this is an area of profound research. And we have in our Open University a course called Awakening the Inner Senses. And so through that course, you could begin to explore some of these lost senses, like the sense of the dream, or the sense of desire, and how do we connect the sense of dream to the sense of desire. Again, through our Open University, and we'll provide the links to that, these are the types of courses that you can engage with here. So another question is, I am curious on how this information was transmitted to the founder, as this is not mentioned. Also, there are many similarities to the mythos of the Galactic Federation that can be easily found online, the different colonizing or seeding races, the energy grid of the Earth, the battling forces between the races, our original divine DNA, and the modification of the DNA by the entropic or dark forces. Is there a direct link to that mythos? Thank you. So this information was not transmitted to Falco, the founder of our community, the spiritual leader of our community. Falco, as a man, began to have his memories reawaken in early childhood. And over the course of his life, through different encounters that he had with information that he had left for himself in past lives, his full memory reawakened. And so he was actually teaching and speaking from the full force of his consciousness. And this information was information that he came here to this planet also to deliver to the collective of this community, and eventually to all of humanity. Okay, so this question reads, the part of me that resonates with this mythology also asks how the timelines will expand from 2021 over the next 5 to 10 years so that humanity wakes up. will there be several timelines with different future histories? This is part of what's addressed in Part 2 and Part 3 of the documentary trilogy, where we speak more specifically about previously existing timelines and the new timeline that we are all living on currently, which is being densified. The previously existing timeline had some pejorative events that happened on it, starting with a nuclear holocaust in 1993. That, in turn, seeded widespread population decimation, a rise in religious fundamentalism, and environmental destruction. And on the previously existing timeline, 650 some odd years in the future, the divine spark in humanity, that piece that links humanity to the world of the divine ecosystem, is extinguished. And so the purpose of creating a new timeline is to be able to arrive at that point in the future without that pejorative event happening. So our final question from our NAAS screening reads, I was disappointed that the bigger story was just so familiar. I mean, the 5 empires, etc. I guess I've always hoped that the non-human world would have a completely different organization, concepts, energies, dynamics. Did you sense that from your friends' stories and information, you were just trying to tell it with words and concepts that humans would be able to relate to? Or is it that similar to us? Not sure if this is clear, but I'm submitting this question anyway. Thank you. So the non-human world, when we speak about this soul force of humanity, we're not just looking at Homo sapiens. We're looking at all of the evolved life force throughout the galaxy. And there are many different complexities of evolved life force throughout the galaxy. And so, yes, of course, on many levels, they would organize themselves diversely than we as earthbound humanity have organized ourselves. There are certainly worlds beyond ours that are more evolved and more conscious, and also perhaps less so. I think we live in a very complex universe, and the story is so much bigger than we're taught or led to believe that it is. So I just want to say thank you for all the questions that were submitted, and my gratitude to everyone who was with us on the 17th of April for the original screening. And now the film is available VOD on either Vimeo or Real House. And we will provide the links to where you can see the film now. So thanks, everyone. I also would like to thank all of our Patreon supporters. It's with your donations that we're able to support our work to continue and finish Part 2 and 3 of the documentary. So thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a beautiful day.